17 horrifying experiments, 5 layers, each going deeper than the previous one. The Little Albert Experiment. Starting off at the top of the iceberg with a horrifying human experiment that changed the life of an innocent child forever. In 1920, the world of psychology witnessed an experiment that would later be etched in history for its controversial nature. The Little Albert Experiment. Conducted by John B. Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner, the study ventured into the dark territory of inducing fear in an innocent infant, known only as Albert B. or Little Albert. The experiment's aim was to demonstrate the power of classical conditioning, the concept suggesting that emotional responses could be conditioned or learned. Little Albert, an unsuspecting 9-month-old infant, became the subject of this chilling experiment. Initially, Albert was presented with a series of stimuli, including a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, masks, and cotton wool. To these, Albert showed no natural fear or aversion. He was particularly interested in the white rat. However, Watson and Rayner's experiment took a sinister turn when they decided to introduce a loud, frightening noise every time little Albert reached out for the rat. The noise, made by striking a hammer against a metal bar just behind Albert's head, was startling enough to make any child cry. Over time, the mere sight of the white rat was enough to trigger a fear response in little Albert, even in the absence of the loud noise. This fear generalized to other similar objects and animals, including the rabbit, the dog, and even a Santa Claus mask. The experiment had effectively instilled a phobia in an innocent child, utilizing his natural startle response to condition a fear of objects that were previously perceived as harmless. The most shocking aspect of the Little Albert experiment lies not just in the methodology, but in the ethical implications it raises. Little Albert was subjected to psychological manipulation that led to a significant alteration in his behavior and emotional state. The experiment was conducted without the consent of his mother, who was unaware of the true nature of the study. Furthermore, there is no record of any attempts to decondition Albert's induced phobias, leaving one to wonder about the long-term psychological effects on the child. Jiankui and the gene-edited babies. The experiment conducted by Chinese scientist Jiankui that led to the birth of the world's first gene-edited babies, Lulu and Nana, sent shockwaves through the global scientific community and the public at large. Utilizing the groundbreaking CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology, he aimed to modify a gene called CCR5 in the hopes of rendering the twins resistant to HIV, a noble objective that quickly became overshadowed by the ethical implications and the manner in which the experiment was carried out. Jiankui's work was groundbreaking in that it was the first time CRISPR was used to edit the genes of human embryos that were then brought to term. The audacity of editing germline cells meant that any changes would be heritable, affecting not just the twins but their potential offspring as well, thereby altering the human gene pool. The experiment ventured into uncharted ethical territory by effectively forcing human evolution. The execution of the experiment was equally alarming. It was done in near total secrecy, without the oversight typically required for such groundbreaking work. There was no peer review, and the scientific community was not informed until after the fact, which is a significant deviation from standard scientific practices that ensure safety, efficacy, and ethical compliance. This lack of transparency and oversight raised serious concerns about the potential risks and unintended consequences of the gene editing performed. The choice of the CCR5 gene, which aimed at preventing HIV, was also contentious. There are less risky and more established ways to prevent HIV transmission, leading many to question whether the potential benefits of this gene editing outweighed the risks. Moreover, the long-term effects of disabling the CCR5 gene were largely unknown, raising fears about potential impacts on the twins' health that could only manifest later in life. The announcement of the gene-edited twins was met with widespread condemnation from the scientific community, bioethicists, and regulatory bodies. It was seen as a brazen and irresponsible leap into human germline editing, a field fraught with ethical dilemmas. The experiment was not just a violation of international consensus on the responsible use of gene editing in humans, but also raised the specter of a slippery slope towards non-therapeutic genetic enhancements and the commodification of human genetics. Stanford Prison Experiment. In the summer of 1971, the quiet corridors of Stanford University became the unlikely setting for one of the most controversial experiments in the history of psychology. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conceived by psychologist Dr. Philip Zimbardo, was designed to explore the dark, uncharted territories of the human psyche. What followed was a chilling descent into the abyss of human behavior, revealing a side of humanity that is as fascinating as it is terrifying. The stage was set in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building, transformed into a mock prison where 24 college students chosen for their psychological stability and health were randomly assigned roles as guards or prisoners. It was a simple premise. Observe how these ordinary, well-adjusted individuals would adapt to their new roles within a controlled environment. But the simplicity of the setup belied the complexity of human nature that was about to unfold. Almost immediately, the thin veil of civility began to crack. The guards, donning sunglasses and khaki uniforms to depersonalize and distance themselves from the charges, quickly embraced their roles with a dedication that shocked even the experimenters. Empowered by their authority and stripped of accountability, they began to devise increasingly cruel and dehumanizing strategies to maintain order and assert their dominance. The prisoners, stripped of their identities and clad in smocks with numbers for names, were subjected to psychological manipulation, arbitrary rules, and humiliating tasks. The bright, spacious halls of Stanford were a far cry from the cold, harsh confines of a real prison, yet the impact on the participants was profound and immediate. What was shocking was the speed at which these transformations occurred. Within days, the experiment had spiraled into a vortex of abuse and subjugation. Guards became increasingly sadistic, devising psychological tortures that included solitary confinement in a dark closet, forcing prisoners to simulate sexual acts, and restricting basic human needs like bathroom access. One of the most infamous brutalities was the counting exercise, where prisoners were forced to repeatedly count and recount the numbers assigned to them, a task both meaningless and mentally taxing, designed to erode their sense of self. The guards would punish any perceived inaccuracies with disproportionate zeal, subjecting the prisoners to solitary confinement in a dark, cramped closet, an experiment that could break the spirit of even the strongest individual. The psychological toll was palpable, with prisoners subjected to constant harassment, arbitrary control, and the ever-looming threat of physical punishment. The guards employed sleep deprivation as a tool of control, waking prisoners at all hours of the night for counts and roll calls, further destabilizing their mental well-being. The prisoners in turn exhibited signs of extreme stress, anxiety, and emotional breakdown. Some were so psychologically affected that they had to be released from the experiment prematurely. The planned 2-week study was abruptly terminated after just 6 days. The ethical lines blurred beyond recognition. The Milgram Experiment. In 1961, in the aftermath of World War II, a pressing question loomed large. How could so many individuals participate in the atrocities of the Holocaust? Enter Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University, who devised an experiment that would plunge deep into the human psyche, exploring the dark corridors of obedience and authority. People were signing up for a study thinking they were part of an investigation into memory and learning. You're assigned the role of the teacher, and there's a learner strapped to a chair in another room, hooked up to what looks like an electric shock machine. The setup is intimidating, with switches ranging from slight shock to danger, severe shock, all the way to a chilling XXX. Your task? Ask the learner questions, and for every wrong answer, administer an electric shock. With each mistake, the voltage increases. You hear the learner's protests, the pleas for mercy, the unmistakable sounds of pain, but there's an authority figure in a lab coat insisting the experiment must continue. Would you stop, or would you press on? Because you were told to. This was the dilemma faced by Milgram's participants. Shockingly, a staggering 65% of them continued to the highest voltage on the machine, despite the apparent agony of the learner. They were ordinary people, just like you and me, pushed into a shocking display of obedience by the mere presence of an authoritative figure. The brutality of the experiment wasn't in physical harm. The shocks were fake, the learner an actor, but in the psychological torment it inflicted on the teachers. They were torn between the agony of their actions and their ingrained impulse to obey authority. The stress, the sweat, the trembling hands as they reached for the next switch, and the haunting realization of what they were capable of under pressure painted a disturbing picture of human nature. Milgram's experiment laid bare a chilling aspect of humanity, the capacity to inflict pain, even when every fiber of our being screams against it, simply because we're told to. The experiment, while groundbreaking, left many participants distressed, grappling with the implications of their actions, testament to the profound impact of Milgram's exploration into the depths of obedience and authority. The Nazi twins experiment. We're going in deeper into the iceberg, with each case getting more and more disturbing and chilling. Starting off with the notorious Nazi twins experiment. During the dark years of World War II, within the grim confines of Auschwitz, one of the most notorious concentration camps, Joseph Mengele, infamously known as the Angel of Death, conducted a series of abhorrent experiments that have since been etched in history for their sheer brutality. Mengele, with a particular fascination for twins, subjected them to inhumane medical experiments that defy any semblance of ethical conduct. Mengele's obsession with twins stemmed from his twisted interest in genetics and eugenics. Upon their arrival at Auschwitz, twins were immediately separated from their families and placed under Mengele's care. What awaited them was far from care. It was a series of experiments that can only be described as torture. Mengele's procedures included injecting twins with lethal germs to study the effects of diseases. Innocent children, stripped of their humanity and reduced to mere test subjects, were exposed to typhus, tuberculosis, and other deadly pathogens, with Mengele coldly observing the progression of the diseases. The experiments did not stop at disease injection. Mengele also performed forced sterilizations and sex change operations without consent or anesthesia, pushing the boundaries of medical ethics into the realm of sheer barbarism. Twins underwent surgeries that were not only excruciatingly painful, but also carried high risks of infection and death. Mengele's fascination with changing the natural course of human biology led him to conduct these surgeries, viewing the twins as expendable in his quest for twisted scientific knowledge. The cruelty of Mengele's experiments knew no bounds. He conducted vivisections, dissecting live subjects to examine the effects of his interventions. Twins were also subjected to endurance testing, where they were placed in high-pressure chambers, subjected to extreme temperatures, and exposed to various chemical agents to study their physiological responses. Many of these experiments resulted in death, permanent injury, or severe psychological trauma. The twins, often young children, were stripped of their identities, referred to by numbers rather than names. They lived in constant fear, not knowing which day might be their last or what new horror Mengele would subject them to. The psychological torment was as profound as the physical pain, with survivors carrying the scars of their experiences for the rest of their lives. The Monster Study. In 1939, a chilling experiment took place that would later be dubbed the Monster Study. This wasn't a study of creatures from horror tales, but rather an investigation into human speech conducted by Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor at the University of Iowa. Their laboratory, an orphanage in Davenport, Iowa, where 22 unsuspecting children became the subject of an experiment that would leave deep, lasting scars. These children, already vulnerable and without a family's support, were suddenly thrust into a sinister study of stuttering. The children were split into two groups, but none of them were prepared for what was to come. For some, this experiment would be a nightmare that wouldn't end with waking. The first group, the control group, received positive speech therapy, where their speech abilities were praised and encouraged. But the second group wasn't so fortunate. These children, some of whom had never had any speech issues, were subjected to relentless negative speech therapy. They were criticized, belittled, and told they were stutterers, even when they weren't. The confusion and fear of being told your speech, your voice, the very tool you use to express yourself, is flawed, was jarring to these children. Tudor and Johnson didn't stop at mild criticism. They hammered in their cruel labels, insisting the children were doing poorly and that their stuttering was bound to get worse. The results were as heartbreaking as they were predictable. Children who had spoken freely began to stutter, their confidence shattered. Those who had minor speech issues became nearly mute, terrified to speak and face further humiliation. For some children, the effects were devastatingly long-term. Constant berating eroded their self-esteem, leading to social withdrawal and academic difficulties. The natural flow of their speech was disrupted, replaced by hesitation and a fear of speaking up. The psychological torment didn't just fade away with the experiment's conclusion, it followed them, a shadow over their lives, impacting their ability to communicate and eroding their self-esteem. The monster study is a harrowing tale of how vulnerable children were used as pawns in a psychological experiment with no regard for their well-being or consent. Instead of being looked at as humans, they were looked at as mere guinea pigs. The Willowbrook Experiments. Between 1956 and 1972, a series of chilling experiments took place at Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York, an institution for children with intellectual disabilities. In a shocking abuse of power and ethics, researchers deliberately infected vulnerable residents with the hepatitis virus. The aim? To study the transmission of the disease and to test the effectiveness of vaccines. But the cost was unimaginably high, and the means? Unconscionably brutal. The most vulnerable members of society, children with intellectual disabilities, were being used as human guinea pigs in a medical experiment without their consent or understanding. The researchers, led by Dr. Saul Krugman, saw an opportunity in the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions of Willowbrook to conduct their study on hepatitis transmission. New arrivals at the institution were the prime targets for these experiments. The method of infection was as direct as it was horrifying. The children were fed extracts from the stools of infected individuals or injected with blood containing the virus. Yes, you heard that correctly. In others, the virus was directly injected into their bodies. The rationale behind such a horrifying approach was the assumption that these children would contract hepatitis due to the institution's overcrowded and unsanitary conditions anyway, so their deliberate infection was justified in the name of research. These children, already grappling with the challenges of their conditions, were intentionally exposed to a potentially deadly virus, all in the name of science. The brutality of the experiment didn't stop at infection. Once the children contracted hepatitis, they were observed like specimens in a lab, their symptoms and suffering meticulously documented, but not always alleviated. The children endured the full brunt of the disease. Nausea, abdominal pain, jaundice, and fever became their daily reality. The psychological impact on these young patients, already vulnerable due to their intellectual disabilities, was profound and lasting. They were not only battling a physical illness, but also coping with the emotional and psychological trauma of being used as tools in a medical experiment without their consent or understanding. The justification for this? The belief that the children would inevitably contract hepatitis due to the institution's poor conditions, so why not control the circumstances of infection for research? The Willowbrook experiments continued for years, hidden from the public eye under the guise of medical research. It wasn't just the physical suffering of the children that marked these experiments as atrocious, it was the utter disregard for their dignity, their rights, and their humanity. The revelation of these experiments sparked outrage, highlighting a dark period in medical research where the ends were thought to justify the means, no matter how unethical. The Willowbrook hepatitis experiments stand as a stark reminder of a time when the most vulnerable were exploited in the most heartless ways imaginable, all under the banner of scientific progress. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, initiated in 1932, was a horrifying example of medical neglect and deception under the guise of scientific research. The U.S. Public Health Service, in partnership with the Tuskegee Institute, embarked in the study under the pretense of offering health care to 600 African American men in Alabama. Among these men, 399 had syphilis, while the remaining 201 served as controls. The true nature of the study was cloaked in deceit. Participants were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a term vague enough to encompass various conditions but never revealing the reality of their participation in a study for untreated syphilis. The promise of free medical care, meals, and burial insurance was enough to secure their cooperation, exploiting their socio-economic vulnerabilities. As the study progressed, the men were subjected to invasive and often painful tests under the guise of receiving treatment. Spinal taps were performed without proper explanation, presented as a necessary procedure for their treatment. These procedures were not only misleading but also added unnecessary risk and discomfort to the participants. The true brutality of the experiment lay in the withholding of treatment. By the 1940s, penicillin had become the standard and effective treatment for syphilis. However, the men in the Tuskegee study were deliberately kept from this life-saving medication. Researchers went to great lengths to ensure that participants did not receive treatment from other sources, including issuing lists of names to local doctors and medical facilities to prevent them from getting penicillin. The consequences of untreated syphilis are severe and can be fatal. Participants suffered from a range of debilitating health issues: skin ulcers, heart disease, neurological problems, and severe pain. The disease took a toll not just on the men but also on their families, as syphilis can be passed on to partners and from mothers to their children at birth, leading to a cycle of suffering and illness that extended far beyond the original subjects of the study. The study's design ensured that researchers passively observed the progression of the disease, treating the men as mere data points rather than human beings deserving of care and dignity. This approach to the study highlighted the dehumanization and racial discrimination inherent in the experiment, as it was predicated on the exploitation of African American men who were deemed discardable by the researchers. The Tuskegee syphilis study continued unabated for 40 years, only coming to an end in 1972 after a whistleblower exposed the unethical practices of the study to the press. The revelation of the study's true nature shocked the nation, leading to widespread public outrage and a re-evaluation of ethical standards in medical research. The legacy of the study is a grim reminder of a period in American history when human rights were disregarded in the name of science. Unit 731 Experiments. We're at the middle of the iceberg now, where things are getting more serious and horrifying. The upcoming experiments will truly shock you with their brutality. Between 1937 and 1945, during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, one of the most horrifying chapters in the history of human experimentation was written by Unit 731, a secret unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. Located in the puppet state of Manchukuo in northeast China, Unit 731 conducted a series of brutal and inhumane experiments on thousands of prisoners of war and civilians, including men, women, and children. Led by General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 was tasked with developing biological and chemical weapons, but the methods they employed to achieve this were unimaginably cruel. The victims, referred to as logs by the researchers to dehumanize them, were subjected to experiments that are difficult to comprehend in their sheer brutality. One of the most gruesome aspects of Unit 731's activities was the practice of vivisection. Prisoners were often infected with diseases such as plague, anthrax, and cholera. Then, without any form of anesthesia, they were cut open while still alive so that the researchers could observe the effects of the diseases on the human body. These vivisections were not only conducted for research purposes, but sometimes as a form of grotesque entertainment. But the atrocities didn't stop there. Prisoners were also used in grenade and flamethrower tests, subjected to freezing temperatures to study frostbite, and placed in pressure chambers until their eyes popped out from their sockets. Biological warfare tests involved the deliberate release of plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities to study the spread of the disease, leading to outbreaks that killed thousands of innocent civilians. Unit 731's experiments on humans also included forced pregnancies and simulated strokes, heart attacks, and hypothermia. The goal was to understand the limits of the human body, but the cost was an appalling loss of life and suffering. The unit operated under a veil of secrecy, and at the end of the war, much of the evidence was destroyed, and many involved were granted immunity in exchange for their research data. The legacy of Unit 731 is a chilling reminder of the depths of cruelty that can result from unbridled ambition and the absence of ethical constraints. The atrocities committed by this unit stand as some of the most barbaric acts of human experimentation ever recorded, a dark testament to the capacity for inhumanity in the pursuit of scientific and military dominance. The Aversion Project. During the dark era of apartheid in South Africa, a horrific series of experiments known as the Aversion Project were conducted on homosexual individuals within the military, aiming to cure their sexual orientation. Spearheaded by Dr. Aubrey Levine, these experiments subjected thousands of gay and lesbian soldiers to inhumane treatments, including electric shock therapy, chemical castration, and even gender reassignment surgery, all without the informed consent of the victims. The backdrop to this atrocity was the apartheid state of South Africa, a regime of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination where the military played a crucial role in maintaining the oppressive status quo. Within this context, homosexuality was deemed a threat, a deviancy that the military sought to eradicate. The methods employed in the Aversion Project were barbaric. Victims were forced into electric shock therapy, where electrodes were attached to their arms and painful shocks were administered as they were forced to view homosexual stimuli, followed by heterosexual imagery, in an attempt to induce a change in sexual preference. The sheer brutality of this method was not only ineffective but also deeply traumatizing. When electric shock therapy failed to produce the desired conversion, the project resorted to even more drastic measures, such as chemical castration, further compounding the victim's suffering. The project's ultimate and most drastic intervention involved gender reassignment surgery, based on the misguided notion that changing one's physical sex would correct their sexual orientation. This often resulted in incomplete surgeries, leaving individuals in a state of physical and psychological limbo, with some even losing their lives during these procedures. The impact of the Aversion Project on its victims was devastating. Many were left with deep psychological scars, and some, unable to cope with the trauma, took their own lives. One tragic example is that of Gene Erasmus. In 1980, he was subjected to chemical castration by Dr. Levine, but this was not the end of the homophobic treatment he endured. He was made to commit gang rape against Angolan women by his officers, and he was subject to all manner of abuse by his comrades. The details of the events were described in an audio recording left by Gene shortly before he took his own life, just one example of the impact the Aversion Project had upon its victims. Dr. Aubrey Levine, the architect of this nightmare, eventually fled to Canada, where he continued his medical practice until his past atrocities came to light. Despite being exposed and brought to trial for sexual assault in Canada, Levine never faced justice for his actions in South Africa, leaving a wound in the fabric of society that remains unhealed. Project MKUltra. Project MKUltra, one of the most infamous undertakings by the CIA, spanned 2 decades from 1953 to 1973. This covert program was the stuff of nightmares, so sinister and wrapped in secrecy that it seems more at home in a dystopian thriller than in the United States history. The goal was chilling in its simplicity and horrifying in its execution: to master mind control. Under the guise of national security during the Cold War, the CIA launched MKUltra to develop techniques that could be used against Soviet enemies. But the means to this end were dark and involved a wide array of unethical experiments on human subjects, many of whom had no idea they were part of a test. The victims were being dosed with LSD without their knowledge or consent. This was a reality for countless unsuspecting individuals, including CIA employees, military personnel, doctors, other government agents, and members of the general public. The drug was administered in various settings, sometimes in a controlled laboratory environment, other times more nefariously in social situations. The subjects plunged into intense psychedelic experiences, often without any preparation or understanding of what was happening to them, leading to long-lasting psychological damage and, in some cases, tragic outcomes. But the horrors of MKUltra didn't stop at drug experiments. Sensory deprivation was another pillar of the project, where individuals were isolated in chambers, cut off from all sensory inputs. This method aimed to break down the subject's psyche, making them more susceptible to suggestion and control. The experience was agonizing, pushing many to the brink of insanity as they lost touch with reality in the echoing silence of their confinement. Isolation experiments often went hand in hand with sensory deprivation. Subjects were left alone in pitch-black rooms for days, with no human contact, no sounds, and nothing to see. The psychological toll was immense, with many experiencing hallucinations, deep anxiety, and a sense of profound disconnection from the world. Verbal and sexual abuse were also tools in the MKUltra arsenal, used to degrade and break the spirit of subjects. The aim was to find breaking points, to see how much a person could endure before they would give in or break down completely. The project's breadth was staggering, involving over 150 human experiments across various institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. The scale and severity of the breaches of ethics, human rights, and dignity were unparalleled. When the existence of Project MKUltra was finally brought to light in the 1970s, it sent shockwaves through the American public and the world. The legacy of MKUltra is a grim reminder of the depths to which governmental bodies might sink under the banner of defense and control, leaving behind a trail of broken lives that continue to haunt society to this day. The Guatemala Syphilis Experiments. From 1946 to 1948, a chilling series of experiments unfolded in Guatemala, now known infamously as the Guatemala Syphilis Experiments. Orchestrated by American doctors, this venture into the depths of ethical misconduct involved deliberately infecting vulnerable individuals with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. The subjects, largely composed of soldiers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even orphans, were unsuspecting pawns in a grotesque game of scientific inquiry. The primary goal of these experiments was to test the effectiveness of penicillin, a drug newly heralded as a miracle cure for bacterial infections. However, the methodology employed was nothing short of barbaric. The researchers, bypassing any semblance of consent or ethical considerations, chose individuals who were unable to defend themselves, a decision that starkly reflects the inhumanity of the project. For some, prostitution was used as a means to transmit the disease, a method that was not only ethically reprehensible but also flagrantly violated the rights and dignity of all involved. Others were directly inoculated with the bacteria, their bodies becoming living laboratories for the sake of medical experimentation. The suffering inflicted upon these individuals was profound. Syphilis, left untreated, can cause chronic health issues, including neurological and cardiac problems, blindness, and severe pain. Yet the experimenters coldly observed the progression of these ailments in their human subjects. The goal was to allow the infections to advance to a point where the effectiveness of penicillin could be tested, a process that involved immense and unnecessary suffering. The most vulnerable were not spared in these experiments. Psychiatric patients, already grappling with their own challenges, were subjected to this exploitation without a whisper of consent. Orphans, some of the most defenseless members of society, were also included in this macabre study. The violation of these individuals, already marginalized and without advocates, marks a disturbing chapter in the history of medical ethics. The Guatemala syphilis experiments were not widely known until many years later, and when they finally came to light, they exposed a shocking disregard for human life and dignity. The fact that these experiments were carried out under the guise of scientific progress and with the backing of notable medical institutions only adds to the horror. These experiments remain a dark testament to the atrocities that can occur when ethical boundaries are crossed in the name of science. The victims, used and abused in the most inhumane ways possible, suffered not just from the physical effects of the diseases, but also from the betrayal of trust at the hands of medical professionals. Human radiation experiments. We're nearly at the bottom of the iceberg now. If the previous experiments didn't make you sick to your stomachs, then these coming ones surely will. But before we move on to the stark horrors of human radiation in our next case, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to never miss out on more chilling icebergs like this. In 1944 and 1974, the US government embarked on a deeply disturbing series of human radiation experiments, exposing thousands of unwitting individuals to radioactive substances. This shadowy chapter in American history involved a wide range of participants, including the mentally ill, pregnant women, military personnel, and even children, many of whom were subjected to these dangerous experiments without their knowledge or consent. The primary objective of these experiments was to gauge the effects of radiation exposure on the human body. In the wake of the atomic bomb and during the height of the Cold War, understanding radiation became a national security concern. However, the methods employed to acquire this knowledge were often shockingly inhumane. In one of the experiments, mentally disabled children were fed oatmeal containing radioactive isotopes. The researchers, under the guise of nutritional studies, aimed to observe how the body absorbed these isotopes. The children, unaware of the true nature of the experiment, were effectively turned into human guinea pigs. Pregnant women were not spared from this horror. In several instances, women were administered radioactive iron during their pregnancies to study how the radioactive material passed through the placenta to the fetus. The long-term health implications for both the mothers and their unborn children were largely ignored or minimized by the researchers. Military personnel, often sworn to secrecy and duty, were also subjected to radiation exposure. Soldiers were placed near nuclear test sites to study the effects of radiation fallout on the human body. Aftermath of these exposures included a range of debilitating health issues, from acute radiation sickness to long-term cancer risks, the full extent of which was not always fully disclosed to the participants. Perhaps most alarming were the experiments conducted on individuals without their knowledge or informed consent. Patients in hospitals, particularly those with cancer, were given radioactive materials under the guise of treatment or diagnostic procedures. The line between treatment and experimentation blurred, with patients unknowingly participating in studies that posed significant risks to their health. The use of institutionalized individuals, such as the mentally ill, highlighted the exploitation of vulnerable populations. These individuals, often without the capacity to consent, were chosen precisely because of their inability to refuse or resist participation, raising profound ethical concerns about autonomy and the value placed on certain lives. The victims of these experiments, many of whom suffered long-lasting health consequences, serve as a somber testament to the dark side of scientific exploration when it's divorced from ethical and moral considerations. The Holmesburg Prison Experiments. In the early 1960s, Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia became the unlikely setting for a series of controversial studies led by the University of Pennsylvania. These studies subjected inmates to various tests involving substances like powders, eye drops, face creams, deodorants, toothpaste, and even liquid diets. Depending on the length of the experiment, participants could earn anywhere from $10 to $300, a significant sum compared to the meager earnings from typical prison jobs like shoemaking or plumbing, which paid around 15 cents per day. Al Zabala, an inmate at Holmesburg, was initially intrigued by the opportunity to earn money, but chose a different path by becoming an assistant technician within the research unit, a position recommended by a friend. This job not only offered a monthly salary of $40 to $50, but also allowed Zabala to participate in tests if he wished. His role involved mixing unidentified creams and lotions, and whenever he inquired about their purpose or the subjects being tested, he was met with evasive answers. Zabala noticed the adverse effects these experiments had on his fellow inmates, many of whom were left with burns or scars. Despite having signed consent forms, the inmates felt powerless to seek legal recourse. Although Zabala was apprehensive about participating in the tests himself, promise of earning up to $1,500 from a special study conducted by the Army was too tempting to pass up. After completing a questionnaire and an interview with a psychological team, Zabala found himself among other inmates being injected with a substance he described as far more potent than LSD. This led to a week-long confinement in a padded room under constant surveillance, followed by a month on a liquid-only diet due to difficulties swallowing. This harrowing experience is just one example of the myriad experiments conducted at Holmesburg, predominantly on black male inmates. Other tests involved applying various substances to grids drawn on the inmates' backs and exposing them to intense heat to observe skin reactions. Some experiments even involved the use of dioxin, a highly toxic chemical found in Agent Orange. The origins of these experiments trace back to Albert Kligman, a dermatologist who saw the prison's inmates as a vast resource for his research. Kligman, who had previously used mentally disabled children for ringworm studies, was drawn to Holmesburg by the potential for unlimited experimentation. Despite the lack of official authorization, Kligman conducted his studies with little regard for ethical standards, often joking about the exploitative nature of his work. Despite the eventual lawsuits filed by former inmates, Kligman faced no significant legal repercussions due to statute limitations. He maintained that his work adhered to the scientific and ethical norms of the time, though he was widely denounced by the academic and medical community. Kligman's legacy is marred by the pain and suffering inflicted on countless individuals, yet to many, he remains known for co-inventing Retin A, an acne treatment tested on the very inmates he exploited. Sims' dark legacy in medicine. In the shadows of history, long before the dawn of modern medical ethics, a series of chilling experiments were conducted that shock us to this day. At the heart of this dark chapter is the story of James Marion Sims, often hailed as the father of modern gynecology. But behind his acclaimed medical advancements lies a harrowing tale of suffering and exploitation that raises profound ethical questions. James Marion Sims, a surgeon in the 19th century, embarked on a quest to find a cure for vesicovaginal fistulas, a severe complication of childbirth that left many women incontinent and socially ostracized. However, the manner in which Sims pursued his research is where our story takes a grim turn. His subjects were not volunteers, but enslaved African-American women who, due to their status, could not give or withhold consent. Anesthesia was available at the time, having been introduced in the 1840s, yet Sims chose not to use it for his experimental surgeries. He justified this decision with the now debunked belief that black people endured pain more easily than white people. The women, including one known as Anarcha, underwent excruciatingly painful procedures, sometimes multiple times, without any form of pain relief. Sims's justification for this was rooted in deeply flawed and racist assumptions about pain tolerance among different races. The ethical implications of Sim's experiments are profound and disturbing. They highlight a dark era where the concept of informed consent was virtually non-existent, especially for those under the yoke of slavery. The women subjected to Sim's experiments had no agency or voice. They were viewed not as individuals with rights and dignity, but as mere instruments for medical advancement. It begs us to question, at what cost do we value medical advancements? Nazi human experiments. We're at the bottom of the iceberg now and have saved the best, or worst, for last. In the darkest chapters of World War II, Nazi human experimentation carved a horrific mark in history. In concentration camps where humanity teetered on the edge of oblivion, Nazi doctors conducted experiments on prisoners with a brutality that defies understanding. The hypothermia experiments. The hypothermia experiments were a descent into a living nightmare. Prisoners, often Jews, Roma, or Russian POWs, were forced into freezing tanks of water or left to endure the merciless winter cold. Purpose? To mimic the conditions German soldiers faced and to explore ways to revive frozen limbs. The sheer terror faced by prisoners, including Jews, Roma, and Russian POWs, as they were stripped of their scant clothing and subjected to the merciless embrace of ice-cold water, is unimaginable. These experiments were not just a test of endurance, they were a grotesque dance with death under the guise of scientific inquiry. Victims were plunged into tanks filled with water so cold it bit into their flesh like thousands of needles. The icy grip tightened around them, their bodies convulsing in violent shivers, teeth chattering uncontrollably as hypothermia set in. Their skin turned from pink to blue, a vivid testament to their suffering, as Nazi doctors coldly took notes, observing the effects of the cold on human flesh and spirit. But the horror didn't end there. In a twisted bid to find effective methods of rewarming, some victims were pulled from the icy depths only to be subjected to scalding water or enveloped in steam so hot it scalded their already frostbitten skin. The shock to their systems was often too much to bear, leading to unbearable pain, and for some, the merciful release of death was their only escape. The air in the camps was thick with the screams and pleas of the victims, a symphony of human suffering that echoed off the cold, uncaring walls. These experiments were a stark display of the depths of cruelty to which human soul can sink when stripped of empathy and compassion. The high-altitude experiments. In the high-altitude experiments, the cruelty soared to new heights. The high-altitude experiments conducted by Nazi scientists pushed the boundaries of human endurance to their breaking point, taking place in the sterile, claustrophobic confines of decompression chambers. These chambers, reminiscent of iron coffins, became arenas of unspeakable torment, where the air itself became an instrument of torture. Prisoners, many of whom had never imagined the sensation of flight, were now subjected to the merciless conditions experienced at death-defying altitudes. As the chambers sealed, a sinister silence would fall, soon to be shattered by the hiss of escaping air. The pressure dropped rapidly, simulating the thin, unforgiving atmosphere tens of thousands of feet above the earth. The victims' chests heaved in desperation as they struggled for oxygen, their eyes wide with the dawning realization of the ordeal they faced. The air, so vital and yet so scarce, became a rare commodity, each breath a battle against the encroaching shadows of unconsciousness. In a grotesque twist, some prisoners were chosen for an even more harrowing procedure, brain surgery without the mercy of anesthesia. Their scalps were sliced open, skulls drilled into, all while they were acutely aware, feeling every agonizing manipulation as scientists coldly observed the effects of pressure on the human brain. The screams of these conscious victims, their pain unimaginable, echoed off the chamber walls, a haunting testament to the depths of human cruelty. The psychological impact of these experiments was as profound as the physical agony. Stripped of all control, reduced to mere objects of curiosity, the prisoners faced not only the terror of the experiments themselves, but the relentless stripping away of their humanity. The fear, the helplessness, the sheer unpredictability of each moment turned these chambers into centers of psychological torment. When the war ended and the full extent of these horrors came to light, the world recoiled in horror. The establishment of the Nuremberg Code was a direct response to these atrocities, an attempt to ensure that such disregard for human life and dignity under the guise of scientific progress would never again be tolerated, yet the scars left by the high-altitude experiments serve as a chilling reminder of the price of ethical neglect, a warning that echoes through the annals of history. In the shadows of history, we've witnessed the unthinkable. Human experiments that crossed every line of ethics and humanity. These chilling tales aren't just horror stories from the past, they are stark warnings for the future. This is only what has been uncovered. Much more horrors lie deep within, and who knows, maybe you'll be part of one next.